So welcome to our third Global Tea App video for September 2014. This is my dear sister Tianwu, who's here from Los Angeles.
Hi.
To share some tea with me and talk about this month's Global Tea Hut. It's a very special month because for a long time we've had this idea that once a year in September we would take all the money that we usually spend on a gift and apply it towards a bigger magazine, so that essentially in September every year from now on we'll be giving tea information as the gift.
But why is that? Because there's a special holiday now in China, right? In Taiwan and China.
Yeah. In Chinese calendar is lunar. So this is the largest full moon of the year.
Well, we call in the West the harvest moon.
The harvest moon, yeah. So very important holiday here, and people get together with their family. They don't have to work, so it's usually a 3-day weekend, and it's a lot of abundance involved. So it's a good time, since it's an abundance holiday, it's a good time to give this abundance. And so once a year, there'll be this special edition of the magazine that is twice the length of ordinary months. And so we did also include a little bookmark with some artwork on it so that people can read and reread this longer issue, which is devoted completely to pu'er tea.
My favorite subject.
Good. There's a little box in there. I think it's maybe in the Tea of the Month article. It's right near the beginning.
Is it the Sheng versus Show box?
No, it's a box about information and wisdom.
Oh yes, I read this one.
Yeah, so it's actually in the pu'er processing article.
Yes.
I was wrong, it's not in the Tea of the Month, it's right here. It's on page 23.
I liked this box a lot, actually.
Yeah. So I think this box is really important because it's cool that, we've put together this magazine. I think that maybe this might be the largest collection of pu'er information in English published in one spot to date. So this covers everything from the production and processing of pu'er tea to aging and storing pu'er and all of that.
And the chi as well?
And the chi as well, a little bit, yeah. It's a little bit more linear. It's a little bit more like left brain stuff, which is why I think that box is so important.
Yes.
And why I wanted to talk about that first, which is the box is basically saying that, there is all this information about tea is great and it's wonderful to learn, but there's a sense in which the information, the data, the linear left brain aspect of tea is always limited, and the tea experience itself is infinite, unlimited. So there is no end to what we can experience through tea, to the amount of different experiences that people have through tea as you serve tea, even to people over time, as you yourself know.
Yeah.
And the experience itself is beyond all words and goes way beyond what any amount of information can contain. So the information is always limited and the experience is always unlimited. So there's a knowing that's helpful and there's a knowing that's not helpful. I think that's very much true in the mastery of any art as much as it is in any spiritual cultivation as well. So, there's a point at which too much knowledge about art might get in the way of the creation of art, the creative process. Sometimes musicians, say if I study too much the notes and the history and that stuff, that can either inspire and facilitate the creation of music, or it can get in the way.
Yes.
And the same with the appreciation. If you're in a mode of critiquing and deconstructing a song into its notes and looking for the ways in which the harmonies are or aren't converging or something, you might not be able to just sit back and listen to music. I've heard many musicians say that after they studied music, it became more difficult to appreciate it.
Well, it's the same reason why we start with bowl tea. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's great to have this magazine every year that celebrates all the wonderful things there are to learn about tea, and especially pu'er tea, So, but at the same time, I like that box. I like having that box there, and I want to like draw attention to that box before we begin our discussion. That, to me, there's so much more in the experience of drinking tea than there is in learning about tea. Mm-hmm. Just like I'd rather get to know somebody than learn about them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I could read a biography about you, but then having you in real time is a much different experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's really important. So maybe we get started and drink this tea.
Yeah.
So this month's tea, of course, is a pu'er, because the issue is all about pu'er, and we thought we'd choose a young Sheng pu'er that characterizes a lot of the like strength and power of young pu'er, especially when it's made from old growth trees. So this is one of our favorites. It's from the spring of 2013, and it's from a region in Yuan called Mengku, which is known for its especially pungent and a little bit bitter, strong teas. And traditionally, stronger teas were thought to be better for aging. And this actually comes from a pretty large factory. So usually a lot of the young pu'er that we like to drink is what we call boutique tea, which means it's small producers going to Yunnan themselves out of a love for tea and going to the mountains and like producing their own cakes, as opposed to larger factories like this. But one of the things we love about this tea is, as you'll see right here, this guy.
Is that certified organic?
Yeah, it is certified organic. And, you know...
we love that.
There's in Yunnan, a lot of tea farmers are very small farmers in what is essentially the jungle. So they can't afford certification. So there's a whole lot of pu'er tea that's not certified organic, but yet is super clean.
Yes.
And as far as I'm concerned, here at the Tea Stage Hut and in Global Tea Hut, we support clean tea. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't matter to me whether it's certified or not. But you'll see some vendors using that as an excuse to sometimes sell inorganic teas. So for me, I like it, I like to promote a bit of both. I don't mind that a small farmer isn't able to certify their tea, they can't afford it, or, they're just not interested. It's not important to them. It's not relevant. They live in a jungle. It's all clean. It's just not important for them to certify. And of course, certification has its own issues. There can be corruption involved. There's just issues in it. But it's really nice to see some of the big factories stepping up and doing it so that we have these teas that are a little bit more mainstream, made in a little bit larger quantity, and yet they're made in a traditional way, and they're produced in a clean, healthy way that's sustainable and good for the environment. And this tea actually won one of the biggest Pu'er Expo awards. It won like the best tea of the year at some point. And so not only is it certified organic and produced in a little bit larger quantity, but according to like connoisseurs and people in the tea world that have influence, it is an exceptional tea and actually won some awards. So it's making an impact. And it's showing that, hey, look, this is a tea that's produced in a sustainable, positive way that competes with any other tea. And so it's to show that we don't need to harm the environment to produce high quality tea in larger quantities.
Very important.
Which is very important. It's easy to demonstrate that in small quantities we can produce very high quality tea that's sustainable. But we also need to demonstrate that we can produce large quantities of economically viable tea that is also certified organic. So this tea is called Chao Mu Wang, which we've translated as King of the Forest. You could translate it several ways. Chao Mu is like old growth trees, ancient trees. It's the king of the ancient trees. We've translated it as King of the Forest. We like that.
And what year was the cake pressed?
2013, so last year, spring of last year.
Which definitely brings me to something that I really would like to talk about.
Sure.
Which is the more recent drinking of Sheng pu'er. I was asking you about it a couple days ago. We were talking about it.
Yeah. Here you have a look.
Sure.
Yeah, you know, there's another side box. There's a lot of really cool side boxes in this issue with a lot of...
Oh, it smells so good.
Yeah, it's nice.
Yeah.
There's
that kind of white, like beautiful white sheen on some of the leaves.
Yeah. There's some really nice side boxes in this month's issue. Mm-hmm. And they talk about different aspects of pu'er tea, like different anecdotes and things. And one of the side boxes is pu'er is a genre in its own right. Mm-hmm. So traditionally, there were 6 categories of tea. So white tea, yellow tea, green tea, oolong tea, red tea, black tea, and yeah, that's it. So white, green, yellow, oolong, red, and black. Mm-hmm. And as we often repeat in the magazine, the black and red are often mixed up in the West. People are calling red tea black tea, which is problematic when you have a category of tea called black tea.
Yes.
So the reason for that is because originally the first Europeans who traded with Chinese weren't allowed even 100 steps from the dock. So they never saw tea trees or saw tea being processed. All the original information about tea came to them through dock merchants speaking broken Pidgin English. And the other reason that you often hear is that the tea oxidized more as it rode on the ships to Europe. So by the time it got there, it was more oxidized. But at that time, they actually called oolong tea black tea too. They pretty much called everything black tea. So, you know, you can imagine that all that they knew about tea was from a merchant selling it to them on the docks in broken English. Of course, a lot of misinformation promoted. So, a category, you know, what is a category? A category is not something that exists out in the world. It's for human communication and education. Mm-hmm. And so if the category no longer reflects the reality of the situation, then it's time to abandon those categories and create better ones that are more conducive to communication and education. Sometimes there's a clinging to the old categories, and that prevents science from moving forward. It prevents thinking from moving forward. So I think that the tea milieu, the tea world, no longer really resembles these 6 categories in the sense that pu'er needs its own genre. Pu'er is one of the most popular teas. It's one of the most important teas in the tea world.
And it used to be categorized with black tea.
Yes, it was a black tea.
Got it.
So the reason that it was a black tea is that all pu'er that was consumed at that time, all pu'er was fermented. Right? So
meaning it was put in and aged to a cave to age and not drunk for a certain period of time?
Not necessarily in a cave.
Or in a storage.
A cave is you have to go very old.
Yeah.
You have to go to like ancient times for that, but definitely. So you know there are 2 types of pu'er, Sheng and Shou. There's another huge box about that. So Shou tea is artificially fermented, and Sheng tea is naturally fermented over time, right? So basically, in the 1960s, they started researching for ways to artificially ferment tea that didn't take so long. They wanted to recreate the process that nature creates this mystical, magical tea after 70 years. If you remind me later on, we can talk about why 70 years. Mm-hmm. But after 70 years, a pu'er tea is fully mature. And so 70 years is a long time. So they wanted to speed that process up through science. So they studied some of the other black teas, the other artificially fermented teas, mostly liaobao, and they adapted those processes to pu'er. And then in 1973 is when they got license from the government to actually begin commercially producing Shou pu'er. They actually started earlier, but that's what you'll find in most books is the date, 1973, because that's the date that they got licensed to go into commercial production. Mm-hmm. But there are several like research batches that happened before that.
Okay.
Of course, like a lot of things that have to do with science, they were not successful in recreating the magical, mystical process of pu'er tea, aging. They created a new genre of tea that has to be evaluated in its own terms. So, but, you know, if you go back, all pu'er tea that was consumed fully fermented. You know, in the time when these 6 categories of tea were popular, and they've been around actually for a long time, these six categories of tea. They've been around for a long time. So at that time, all pu'er was consumed fully fermented, either aged Sheng or artificially fermented Shou. You know, when you drink a lot of aged Sheng pu'er, which is just so magical, the changes and the transformations that happen to tea over time are incredible. And so when you drink a lot of that tea, you know, and then someone hands you a young Sheng tea, which is, you know, kind of bitter and astringent, you can see why some people, you know, were not interested in drinking it so much. Also, young Sheng pu'er is cool in nature. Cool not in the Chinese medicinal sense of hot and cold, not in temperature. And Chinese people, their body is generally, there are exceptions, but generally cold. And so drinking young Sheng pu'er was ill-advised by traditional Chinese doctors. So there was that sense that, you know, people, when aged Sheng was more available and cheaper, people drank it or they drank Shou tea. And so it made perfect sense to put all pu'er tea into the genre of black tea. But then the pu'er boom happened in the early 2000s and everything shifted. And now there's far more young Sheng consumed by people all over the world than aged Sheng and Shou put together. So Sheng pu'er obviously is more representational of pu'er in general, because Shou pu'er only goes back to 1973. Sheng pu'er goes back hundreds or thousands of years, depending on what you want to call pu'er. So it's much more it much more exemplifies the genre of pu'er, Sheng.
But they also process the Sheng much different these days because people are drinking it so raw. And is that true? Is that because a tea was going to be put away for such a long period of time, they weren't as concerned with how it tasted as a Sheng?
Definitely, there's a lot more experimentation in processing going on, and there's teas that, like, when we do reviews where we have to drink like 16 teas for a magazine here, there are these teas that we call oolongs. They're like the pu'er teas that are processed similar to an oolong, you know, and they're just processed in some strange way. Actually, what it is that they're withered too much, they're oxidized too high. And it could be because of laziness. They just pick the tea and then they leave it overnight. They don't process it that day. It could be because they stuff too many tea leaves in the bag, or it could be intentional. They're just trying to create new flavors for people to drink. You know, the thing is, the pu'er boom happened so fast that 90% of the people in the pu'er industry are in that industry in the last 10 years. Prior to that, anybody producing pu'er is either doing it because it's their family tradition or they love pu'er. So, you know, back in the day, there was just so much aged pu'er, and it was so much more affordable that people only drank fully fermented pu'er. And then the pu'er boom happened in the early 2000s, and people started drinking a lot more young Sheng pu'er. And since Sheng tea exemplifies pu'er as a genre, and since now more young Sheng is consumed than Shou or aged Sheng, it doesn't make sense any longer for pu'er to be in the black tea category, because the majority of pu'er being consumed in this world is not fermented. It's not aged Sheng and it's not Shou, it's young Sheng. So one alternative way that we could do that, because young Sheng pu'er is akin to green tea. So you could put young Sheng in the green tea category, and you could put aged Sheng and Shou into the black tea category. But that seems more confusing to me than just giving pu'er tea its own genre. I feel like since it's the oldest tea on earth, it deserves its own genre. It's earned it.
Wow. How long does it take for a Sheng to fully ferment?
70 years.
70 years.
70 years. I mean, even that's arbitrary. Why do we say 70 years? Because as Puerh matures, the more time that passes, the more the changes begin to slow down. So the difference between like this 1-year-old tea that we're about to drink and a 5-year-old tea is pretty pronounced. Mm-hmm. The difference between a 5-year-old tea and a 10-year-old tea is very pronounced. Anybody, if I serve a 5-year-old tea and then I serve a 10-year-old tea, anybody's going to recognize the difference. Mm-hmm. The difference between a 10 and 15-year-old tea, not so much. It would take someone who has drunk a lot of Puerh tea to know the difference. Beginners might not be able to separate a 10 and 15-year-old. A 15 and 20, no, right? Now you got to start going 20 to 30, 30 to 50. Right? And when you get to about 70 years, it's not as if the tea stops changing. I've actually drunk even 250-year-old tea, and there's actually, the further back, the older the better, the more juju, the more it changes, it continues to change. But at about 70 years, the change slows down so much that you have to jump a huge amount of time to notice a difference. And the physical structure of the tea liquor is not going to change anymore. In other words, at 70 years, the tea soup is black. It's like black, and then it gets red, and it has the golden ring around it. That's one of the characteristics of aged Puerh, is that it's dark in the middle, it turns into amber and red, and then has a beautiful gold ring. But that color isn't going to change. After 70 years, that color is not going to change. It's going to stay like that. Pretty much the flavor and mouthfeel and the aromas and that kind of profile will stay around there. The physical structure of the tea really doesn't change all that much more. It will. So it is in a sense arbitrary, but it's kind of a tradition. Back in the day when I first started drinking Puerh, 70 years just meant fully mature. That's the way that the old timers kind of talked about it, the way that they drank tea.
They left all tea to age that long before even cracking it open at all?
No, occasionally we'd drink younger teas than that, but there was, in those days there was a lot of aged Puerh, a ton. And it wasn't so expensive. And so most of the time when younger teas were drunk, it was to determine how they were aging. So if at that time, like when young, brand new Sheng Puerh was produced, if it was drunk, it was always evaluated in terms of its candidacy for aging, its aging potential. And so teas like this that are strong and pungent were desired because it was assumed that if a tea had strength, it had strength to kind of go the distance, that it would turn into a good tea in the end. So tea was often drunk in that way if it was young. We would sometimes drink it, but sometimes even just a few steepings to see how it was aging, and then put it away and drink some aged teas.
Was there a point where a tea like that would be drunk, and then someone proclaims this tea is not going to age well?
Yeah, I mean, there's those different opinions, but there's also plenty of instances of teas that were not very good when they were young, turning into great teas when they're old. So there's also this magic. It's like any fermentation. It's like making kombucha or cheese or anything. Like you have 12 jars of kombucha and they're all going to turn out differently, and so you're going to have those unexpected gems. But for the most part, you can say that a garbage tea is going to become a great tea when it's aged. But for me, I like to be careful about. For me personally, I like to be careful about saying derogatory things about any tea, as we were talking about the other night.
Yes.
Because I think that if there are low quality teas, they're low quality because of the decisions that people have made around them. So if low quality teas are low quality because they're produced using chemicals, they're produced out of financial greed, and they're produced with disrespect for nature, that's one kind of a low quality tea. Another kind of low quality tea is just a tea that doesn't taste very nice, but that's probably due to the lack of skill in the producer. So it's not that there's a good or bad tea tree, but we make it so.
Yes. It's delicious.
Really great tea.
Yeah.
Some people who are new to younger Sheng pours, this is, like I said, the tea from Mengku is well known because it's particularly pungent, astringent, strong. So for this month's tea, you got to be sure that when you brew it, you don't oversteep it. You can do what we call flash steep, which means as soon as you add the water, then you immediately decant it and drink it right away.
You also recommend drinking it after you've had some breakfast.
Yeah, young Sheng pour, because it's so astringent, it can upset some people's stomach.
I actually enjoy drinking Sheng tea straight out of bed with nothing in my tummy, but I have experienced those who it's a little acidic for their tummy without anything in it.
Yeah, so it might be a good idea to eat something first if you like to drink tea in the morning.
Yes.
And to be careful you don't oversteep it. I can remember one time I gave some young Sheng pour to a relative of mine, and she likes to drink tea very simply in a like large pot, and then decant it into a cup, and she let it steep for like 4 minutes, and then proceeded to write to me about the extremely bitter tea that I had sent to her. So.
But I also like something that I read that you wrote. Your teacher was saying about people brewing the bitter out of the tea.
Yeah, when people say that this tea is bitter, the answer is that the nature of tea is bitter. Yeah. Tea is a bitter plant. It is a bitter plant, and that's its nature. So, taking the bitter out of it is taking the tea out of it. Tea is a bitter plant. That's its nature. And actually, a lot of the processing, like the sachin, which is the de-enzyming, the frying of tea, kills a green enzyme in it that makes it bitter. One of the things that makes pu'er processing different from other tea is that the sachin is less. So actually, some of those enzymes are left alive. They're important for the fermentation process. So that's one of the reasons tea is more bitter. But actually, it's mostly more bitter and more astringent just because of the trees. So earlier you were talking about how the processing has changed and people have begun processing pu'er tea in different ways because it's now being drunk young. And I wouldn't say that that's predominant. There are some people though processing in new ways because more young Sheng is being consumed and because that market's big and people want to stand out and be new. But as we've talked about in the magazine, and we even talked about it in these videos, different genres of tea, the quality is more or less determined on the tea trees and the producer. So if you take a tea like oolong, it's at least half the quality is in the trees and in the one processing it. So the skill, the gongfu of the one processing it and the trees both matter equally. But in pu'er tea, it's not. It's like 90% the trees. It's all about the trees. And the processing of pu'er tea is very simple. And it's been the same for hundreds of years. So it's a very simple processing method. So most of the bitterness and astringency of pu'er tea is in the tea. But a little bit of it is also to do with the fact that the de-enzyming, the sachin, is less than other kinds of tea. But in general, the nature of tea is bitter. And I think processing the bitter out is emblematic of life in general. That's what you were talking about, my teacher says, is that, we want to process the bitterness out of life. We want life to just be sweet.
Yeah, but unicorns and rainbows. Unicorns
and rainbows and not have some of the pain. But the suffering and pain is also, one of our great teachers. It's we learn a lot from the suffering. In Zen, we say, turn all suffering into medicine. So through suffering, we learn a lot of the important lessons that we need to learn.
It's interesting. I learned something really interesting also about bitterness, which is that our body has all our organs, each individually have all kinds of receptors for bitterness, just the way that our tongue and taste buds have receptors. And so even just the taste of bitter in the mouth wakes up all the organs. That's why things like dandelion and greens that are really bitter are really good for the liver and all of that stuff. So I actually started to really appreciate the bitterness sometimes in the Sheng pu'er when I would drink it.
Yeah, most, the majority of medicinal herbs are bitter.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the oldest names for tea was tu, which means bitter herb. So older than the word cha, which is tea. It was called bitter plant, bitter herb. So it was known for its bitterness, since ancient times. And I think over time, tea lovers begin to even appreciate that. I think in life in general too, I think older people like bitter things more. There's something to that.
Yeah.
But definitely you want to be careful how you steep the stevia. It can be too astringent, too bitter, and you definitely also want to be careful with your stomach. Some people drink Yangshang tea and they get an upset stomach, especially if it's empty.
So you started to kind of talk about how 90% of the importance of pu'er tea comes from the trees, and there's a big topic in the Global Tea Hut this month about Yunnan, which is a really magical place where all pu'er comes from, the birthplace of pu'er, yes?
Yeah, there's an article that talks about the five characteristics of pu'er, five things that make pu'er a special tea. And the first is that there tends to be more living tea within the genre of pu'er than in other genres. We've talked about living tea a lot in magazines and in a lot of our writings, and it's a very important concept around here. It's a translation of what in Chinese literally translates to real tea. But real tea doesn't sound so good in English, and it also has another meaning, which is like real as opposed to fake, which is not what it means. It means like authentic, real. But we like to translate it as living tea, which means it's seed propagated, has room to grow, grows in a biodiverse environment, and has no chemicals, and has a healthy relationship between the people that grow it and the tea trees. So the first characteristic of pu'er is that within the genre of pu'er, there's a lot of tea that isn't living tea. There's a lot of plantation tea also. In pu'er, it's called taidi cha. But there tends to be more living tea. It's easier to find living tea in that genre than in other genres. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as you said, Yunnan. Yunnan is a magical place. The southern part of Yunnan, that forest there, which actually is a forest that, of course, transcends boundaries. It's the birthplace of tea. It's if you as a forest, it also includes parts of Vietnam, Laos, Burma, and a little teeny part of India. So it's not a
single patch.
It's not a single country, of course, and those boundaries flicker anyway.
Yes.
The part that is Laos now was actually a part of China until the mid-19th century. The French took it away. So, but that forest is so small, and yet it's home to 30% roughly of all species in China because it's so vibrant. So it's just such a vibrant place. The plants there are bigger than they are elsewhere. Everything's so full of life, the soil. So Tian was with us in May when we went to Yunnan, and then we talked about it in our July video, and we talked about it in the magazine, and you remember the vegetables?
Yes.
And how they made you feel?
Yes.
Because the soil there is just so strong. So Yunnan itself is the second characteristic that makes pu'er tea special. And the third is the trees. So these trees are big leaf, so that means single trunk with really deep root systems that go down, dozens, if not to 100 meters, down to like the geothermal energy of the earth, down to where it's hot. And trees that you saw that just grow up and ancient. The oldest one we found now is 3,500 years old. So very ancient tea trees like nowhere else on earth. That's the third. Fourth is the water. All the water comes down from the Himalayas. So all that energy coming down from the Himalayas, right?
Is it called the dragon veins? Is that the rivers?
The dragon veins are in Taoist geomancy, which is called feng shui. You probably heard that word, feng shui.
Yeah.
There are these lines that connect heaven and earth. And you can see them in Chinese paintings of landscapes. You can see them coming down. And they're said to be more in Yunnan and Nepal and all around the Himalayas there than anywhere else on earth. Because the Himalayas are the only active mountain range on earth. They're the only young active mountain range, so there's a lot of power there. So, and the water that comes down there is like glacial water from the top of the earth. It's so clean and clear and full of minerals, and that feeds all of that. The Lanchang River becomes the Mao Karn, and it goes all the way down into Southeast Asia, into Laos and Vietnam, and all those countries are fed by that water system, which was traditionally called the 9 dragons because there's 9 rivers. So, and then finally, the final characteristic that makes Puerh tea special is what we humorously call midichlorians.
Yes.
From the Star Wars movies. If you remember in the Star Wars movies, there was these microscopic forms of intelligence that are like all throughout everything, and they could measure how many were in your body, and that like determined your connection to the Force.
Yes.
It was like through those sentient microscopic beings that people connect to the Force. So it's kind of facetious, but it's kind of true too, because before Puerh tea is even picked, before Puerh tea is picked, the leaves are covered in many species of molds and bacteria and funguses and all these microscopic organisms, and that's what makes Puerh tea ferment so magically, because fermentation is about bacteria, and there's a magic in that. You know, by number, our body is 90% non-human DNA, by number. So 90% of the cells in your body are non-human DNA, by number.
Wow.
Not by mass, not by size, because the human cells are much bigger than the non-human ones. But by number, by counting, you have something like 1 trillion cells, and 90% of them are non-human DNA. So we are literally like petri dishes of organisms. When you think about that, it actually opens up a lot of spiritual truths, because it shows you how connected you are. That you're not this single being, that your body is actually beings, plural, in magnitudes of millions, if not billions, just tons of things, and you can't survive without them. So we have a dear friend in LA who you know, Compton, so brilliant. He has a MD, he's a doctor, and he also studies microbiology, and so he's kind of a scientist and a doctor, but he's also very spiritual, so he kind of combines this like element of modern medicine and shamanism. Yeah, he's really in a really powerful way. Yeah. So I gave him a chunk of 1950s pu'er, of a very famous pu'er, Red Mark. And he actually, a few things. One is he told me that the microscopic organisms in this, some of them were thought to be extinct for 200 million years. So he said it was like a museum of microscopic organisms, that there were organisms in there that he had never seen. And the other thing that he did was he extracted some of them and he cultured them, and he made this drink that was similar to kombucha.
I happened to be there on that day where I was the little fly on the wall that was at Temple Tea that day when he brought it over, and I had some.
Yeah.
It was phenomenal.
Yeah, it was incredible how strong and powerful it was. And he gave me a bottle. I brought it back. We tried to keep it going here, but we couldn't. Our batch wasn't as good. It somehow didn't stay alive. But what it demonstrated to me is how strong of a role those microscopic organisms play in the juju, in the medicine of Puerh tea.
Yeah.
I don't want to say that it was as strong as like drinking the tea. Of course it wasn't. I think the leaves play a huge role too. And I've had that tea, so that tea was definitely stronger. But I was expecting it to be a lot more the tea and a lot less the microorganisms. But he when I drank that drink, I was just like, wow, there's a lot in the microorganisms. Yeah, so when I was a kid, I grew up on Star Wars, and I read all the Star Wars books, and my friends had too. So, you know, we always made that joke. We'd sit around, and when we were drinking aged pu'ers, if it was better the tea, we'd say, oh, the midichlorian counts higher in this one. You know, it was our just way of talking about the juju or the chi in the tea. But I remembered that on that day when I drank Compton's mixture, and I remembered then that I had said that, and it came together, that these microorganisms play a huge part in the fermentation of Puerh tea. And they're also why Puerh tea has always been traditionally stored in Southeast Asia, because it needs humidity, and it needs oxygen, it needs the right temperature and humidity and all those things, and other factors that we don't understand, like those microorganisms. In the same way that like you can't make champagne that's really champagne outside of Champagne. And there's another famous alcohol in China, it's the most famous one, and other regions have tried copying it for hundreds of years, but they can't, because as they came to find out later through science, the terroir includes the microbiology. So there's actually some books about that recently, about how we have to, in our discussions of terroir, which is climate and soil and all the things that make a particular place unique in relationship to the agriculture there, that in that we have to also include microbiology.
You started to kind of talk about the storage of tea, which is an article that I read and I really enjoyed and I highly recommend. And the question that came up for me when I was reading that article is something that you said around to understand an aged tea or how a tea ages, you have to have drank a lot of aged tea to understand the storage of pu'er. And so for us in these days, that is not necessarily so accessible to drink so much aged tea. How would then one learn this process or get to know the process of storing tea?
Yeah, earlier you talked about how some people, were against the shift of like the mainstream starting to drink so much young Sheng. I was one of those people.
Yeah.
When young Sheng started to become popular and I would go out and meet friends and they'd be like, try this. I'd be like, no, I don't want to try that. And I even started writing articles, saying that no, pu'er tea is not pu'er until it's been aged or artificially fermented. Pu'er is a fermented tea. This young stuff is not pu'er, and I felt that way. But then as time changed and I adapted myself and I stopped comparing young Sheng pu'er to aged Sheng pu'er and started enjoying them on their own terms rather than evaluating all my tea in terms of how it will age. I started to learn to just appreciate it for itself, and to then I also the next step was I also learned to kind of enjoy pu'er tea at many different ages. So I began to enjoy adolescent pu'er, 10-year-old pu'er, 15-year-old pu'er, 20-year-old pu'er. Once I stopped, in the beginning, I had spent some years, 5 or 10 years drinking only aged Sheng. So young Sheng just wasn't as good to me. But then when I stopped comparing them and just let them be, I began to enjoy young Sheng pu'er more and more, and to find that it has its own beauties and its own charms. I'm really glad that shift happened to me. It was definitely in the spirit of tea, and nowadays I enjoy pu'er of many different ages and for different reasons. Because young Sheng pu'er has its own charms, and aged pu'er has its own charms, and middle-aged pu'er has its own charms. But I think in terms of long-term storage of pu'er tea, definitely you have to drink a lot of aged tea. Unfortunately, aged tea has become very expensive.
Right.
And to me, that kind of betrays the spirit of tea. To me, I don't like all the hoopla. When I was drinking aged tea back in the day, it wasn't a thing. It was like on a Tuesday afternoon, you might drink 2 70-year-old and 1 100-year-old tea. And that was just a Tuesday afternoon. There was nothing crazy special about it. But nowadays, it's like somebody brings out a Hongyin, a 50-year-old tea, and everybody wants to take out their camera and flip out and take photos of the whole session and record it and put it on their Facebooks and and talk about the money a lot. Oh, this is worth so much money. We're drinking hundreds of dollars now, and And I think all that isn't in the spirit of tea, which is just about giving and sharing and being together and enjoying the spirit of tea. So I think some of that connoisseurship and the price of vintage tea has got a little bit strayed, in my opinion, from my tea practice and from the way that I view tea. So one way is, of course, to age tea yourself. Now there's so much more tea produced. You can buy a lot of younger teas for more affordable prices and then age them yourself. And then when you're older, you'll have a lot of aged teas to drink. And I think you were also asking just what do you do if you can't afford aged teas right now? Because now you have to be, really rich to be able to drink those teas. Some of them cost, 100,000 or more US dollars for a cake. It's just insane. The good news is that in the last 10 years, more Sheng pu'er has been produced than ever before. Some of the productions, if you go back 70 years, the production was like a ton for a year, right? There's factories now producing thousands of tons. So there's a ton of pu'er. So in the coming 50 years, there will be a lot more aged tea than there is now.
Right.
If it's of the same quality, it's hard to say. The world was a different place back then, and things were cleaner and better. So that's part of the magic of the old tea now. that it comes from a time before agrochemicals and all that. So that's another interesting shift that I saw happen as the Puerh boom happened in the early 2000s. The first shift we already mentioned was people drinking young Sheng tea, and then over time learning myself to appreciate and love young Sheng tea, as well as all different other kinds of Puerh. And the second shift was this shift in storage. So back in the day, Puerh tea was very cheap tea, especially young tea. It's very cheap. So there wasn't a lot of intention in the storage of it, not like today. A couple of things changed. But I can remember in the early 2000s, I was sent by this magazine to Hong Kong to interview a very famous man, Mr. Bai, who's like fourth generation storing Puerh tea, fourth or third generation, I don't remember. But his family for a long time has been storing and aging Puerh tea in Hong Kong. And I was there to interview him about storage of Puerh. And I asked him, essentially, like, how do you store Puerh? And I have all these questions. And he was looking at me like I'm nuts. And then I thought, well, I'm saying it wrong. So, my Chinese wasn't so great at that time. So I rephrased it in another way. And again, he still looked at me. So then there was someone there to help me translate in case I came into these problems. And then I had her ask him. And again, he just scratched his head and brewed some tea. And then finally, like, I really kept pushing. Because this was like the focus of my article. So I kept pushing and pushing. And finally, he put his hand on the table and he said, how do I store Puerh tea? I rent a warehouse. I buy the tea and I put it inside. Yeah, so there wasn't any science to it. The science was you rent a room and you put the tea inside. For the most part. I mean, there were some ways of speeding up the storage for others. He wasn't into that. There was this kind of like traditional storage where they put the tea in a more humid environment to speed it up. That's called wet storage or traditional storage. That's a whole other topic.
Yeah, it talks all about that in the article.
Yeah, in the article. So he, in those days, tea wasn't so expensive. So they just put it into a room and let it do its thing naturally. So two things happened that changed. One was that in the 70s and 80s, the quality of life in Taiwan went way up. And people, of course, started developing more and more culture, and tea became very popular. And the tea industry in Taiwan started to mainstream. So small, hand-produced teas from central Taiwan started to shift more towards bigger plantations and lighter oxidation and greener tea that would suit the mainstream more. And a lot of the tea masters at that time were traditionalists, and they liked the heavily oxidized roasted oolong that is actually traditional oolong, and they didn't like that shift, so a lot of them started drinking more and more Puerh. And at that time in Hong Kong, they were about to shift into mainland rule. So in 1997, they were going to shift and become China again, and they didn't know what was going to happen. So a lot of businesses were liquidating. It was the perfect time for a ton of aged Puerh to shift and move over to Taiwan, which it did. And the difference was that in Hong Kong, the Puerh tea had been, up until that point, a little bit more everyday. It was something that people drank like in dim sum. Of course, there were collectors and lovers, but they were the minority. The majority of people treated Puerh tea as something you have at dim sum restaurants, a part of everyday life, right? Whereas when it came to Taiwan, there was a kind of connoisseurship, a collector's attitude. You could say they geeked out on it. And books started to appear. This is why the majority of Puerh books were written by Taiwanese. They were the first ones to start to study it and go into the history of it and look at the wrappers and look at the cakes. And so there was that, number one, was more of an interest in it. And number two, it started to become more and more expensive. So it's one thing to take something that costs a nickel and put it in a room and just let it age and see what happens. But when you start paying $50, $100 a cake, you care more about how it's stored. And you want to take care of it properly. So nowadays, if you go to a proper professional storage place in like Guangzhou, you'll see they've got it all laid out really well. All the tea is like 2 feet off the ground. For every 10 square meters of space, there's a huge basket of charcoal that's meant to absorb extra humidity and also purify the air of any odors. They're doing things well because the tea is worth a lot more. So the value of the tea and the interest in the tea changed the way that people store it. They started storing it intentionally, as opposed to just putting it on a shelf and letting it happen naturally.
Which is how it was discovered to begin with.
How it was discovered, yeah. I mean,
someone put some tea away and then came back to it X amount of years later. And
yeah, I mean, that's one way of looking at it, and that is probably how some people discovered it. There wasn't one discovery.
There usually never is.
Yes. So it's not like, you know, you go back hundreds or thousands of years. You go back thousands of years. It's not like one person discovered that you could age tea and then told everybody. Many people discovered it in many different ways. What you read in books, though, I think is problematic because it's misleading. There is often this slant in history where a lot of historians look back on our ancestors as though they were stupid. Like that they discovered tea by going around licking plants in the forest. And it's like, oh, no, that one's poisonous because somebody dies. And that one's medicine. Like they had to discover bumble, right? So you often read that the aging of pu'er happened because they put the pu'er cakes on horses and transported it to Tibet and Mongolia. And then when they got there, they drank it and were like, oh, it's different, right? But that assumes that someone who has spent their entire life around tea from birth has to bumble onto their discoveries. And what I would say is that, yes, some people, some merchants may have discovered the ageability of tea in that way. There were also sages drinking tea in the mountains in their meditation and communing with the spirit of tea. And they wouldn't have needed to bumble into that. They would have known that it was changing. It's so, as I said, the first 5 years, huge change. The second 5 years, huge change. The difference between a 5 and 10-year-old pu'er, anyone can tell. So you don't really have to bumble onto it.
Right.
They would have known right away, immediately. So while some people may have discovered it in that way that you read about in books, in a like accidental way, I don't think the history of humanity is a bunch of accidents that we happen to bumble upon. I think that there were many, many instances in time where there were very sensitive human beings who knew things. And the reason I know that is because tea has also taught me things. And my sensitivity is probably much lower than a Taoist mendicant or hermit living in the forest, meditating 16 hours a day or whatever, and eating only plants, 1,000 years ago, completely distraction-free. His day consists of meditation, qigong, and tea, and that's it. He was obviously a lot more sensitive than I am. And so if tea is speaking to me and teaching me things, then obviously he would have been even more connected. And his insights would have been even more developed. So they would have known.
Yes.
They always knew.
It seems that there'll be a vast majority too of experimental types of aging, because there's people also storing in different ways and all kinds of different experimentations around storing. Yeah,
people always ask me like if tea is always traditionally stored in Southeast Asia, but I live in LA. How do I store my tea?
Right.
And the answer is I don't know what will happen to your tea. I don't know.
Right.
Tea probably it won't be as good. Just what we've seen. I've had friends who have taken tea back to England, for example, and then come back here and tried it. The one here. We just had a Russian brother from Siberia come. He left some tea here, and he came and tried the difference, and the one here was obviously aging a lot better. What will happen though, I don't know. Give it a try. If we're talking about a few cakes of tea, it's not a big deal. Number one, if you're going to drink it, it doesn't matter. In 5 years, it's not going to die. So just drink it. And number two, if you're just storing a few cakes of tea, then no problem. Do it and report the results to all of us. So, it's kind of like the analogy I use is like with stocks. Let's say you're going to invest a few $100s in stocks, $300. If it's only $300, why not buy some different stocks? Take a risk. You might get lucky. Which is not to say don't study a little bit, but it's not such a huge deal. But if you're going to invest 10,000 US dollars, you better go with some stocks that are less risky and a little bit more consistent or whatever. So if you're going to take some cakes and take them to Los Angeles and see what happens, no problem. If you want to buy a huge quantity of pu'er, then the fact of the matter is this. The only place on earth to create fully mature pu'er tea successfully is Southeast Asia. The only examples of successfully aged, fully mature pu'er tea we have are from Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China, and Malaysia. So, that's the sure thing. Yeah. And even then, not sure, because it's not as if every tea that was put there turned out well either. Right. There's always subtle influences. The energy of where a tea is stored also affects it. We've done a lot of experiments, as it talks about in the magazine, with storing tea in different locations. And one time we put tea in a shop and in somebody's home and in a cave where 3 monks were doing sadhana, all day long, meditating. And after 5 years, we drank those teas. And the one that was with the monks obviously was so different. We drank them blind with about 40 or 50 people. And every single person was able to successfully determine which one of the teas was the one from the monk's cave. Blind.
So, this special pu'er edition is just really amazing and chock full of tons of information, linear and non-linear. And there's some other really amazing articles by our lovely Estonian friend Steve. And there's an article about Katya and Dennis and their Russian tea wedding. And so I just highly recommend that you all take a moment while you're drinking tea at home and peruse through it and read all of the beautiful writings that are in this edition.
Yeah, there's so much.
Yeah, and there's also something else that that you introduce in this edition as well, which is the Ilau special edition cakes for the center.
Yeah.
So I just got one, and I'm really excited about it. And when we were in Ilau, the cakes were pressed. And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So this year. And every year for the last, 3 or 4 years, but 2 years in a big way, we've made some pu'er cakes to raise money for the building of our new center, Light Meets Life. As most of you know, a couple of years ago we were donated some land, and our intention is to build a big free tea center where we can host a lot more people than here, but with the same spirit that this place has, only on a bigger scale. And so these pu'er drives that we do every year, all of the proceeds that are raised from them, none of it goes to support this center or Global Tea Hut or any other project. It all stays in a bank account in Los Angeles and is used as savings towards building that new and future center. So this is the second year that we've done a bigger pu'er drive to raise money for that. And this year we produced 3 cakes. 2 of them are a little bit... produced in a little bit larger quantity. They're a little bit cheaper. They aren't here yet, but they will be soon, and we'll of course announce them. So this is the brightest of the 3, the best of the 3. There's only 150 of these cakes. The tea itself comes from trees that are between 1,000 and 1,800 years old. Trees that we ourselves saw when we hiked in Yuan. And when we were there, we blended this with 2 teas together. She had 3 or 4 different teas that were from these ancient trees. And we found 2. One of them had a lot of qi, if you remember. It was very deep and powerful. And then there was another one that was not as deep and powerful, but much more flavorful, much more fragrant and fruity and delicious. So in the end, we decided to have 80% of the deep, strong tea and about 20% of the more flavorful tea to have the best of both worlds. And it really is an amazing tea. You just smell it and already really...
changed so much from when you gave me the cake when I first got here to smell, and the smell was just so much more potent and beautiful and present and deep than when we were even, playing with the loose leaf teas and trying them in Ilau. I'm really excited about it. Yeah,
so also every one of them comes with a hand-painted box that's unique. They all have different paintings. So we're putting a lot of love in them. And then inside, there's a card that describes the tea and where it comes from and how it was made. And then 3 photographs. One photograph of NTI, who's the producer of this tea. and one of the trees that this tea comes from, and one of the king tea tree, the 2,007-year-old tree that sits at the top of the mountain where all these trees come from. And he's the elder. And we prayed at his feet that this tea have good medicine for everybody.
Yeah, in the first video, at the end there was footage of us at the bottom of that tree, right?
Singing and praying, yeah.
Yeah.
So each box is signed and numbered. This is 39 out of 150. There's about 100 of them left right now as of this video.
Yeah.
I think they'll go pretty quick though. And as I said, all that money will help to build our future center. And the minimum donation is $100 US, though amazingly, about 50 of them have already sold. And I think like 46 of those people gave more than the suggested donation. So it's really amazing. Although, you know, we have to be grateful even for the suggested donation.
Yes.
Our cost, this tea like this, a very precious tea like this, from such ancient trees is very expensive. And Auntie I actually gave us the tea at half price. So she donated essentially half of the tea that went into this. But still, with the box and the tea and the shipping and everything, our cost is somewhere around $60. So around $40 of that donation will go to building Light Meets Life, which is good. It's a good amount. And at the end of the day, we'll have raised quite a bit and be closer to our goals of starting to build. Of course, the best way for all of you to help us to get closer to that goal is to help spread awareness of Global Tea Hut. As soon as Global Tea Hut passes about 1,000 members and starts moving towards 2,000 members, we can begin to start building. So just in sharing this experience, this magazine, this tea, this community, as it grows with more and more people, we get closer to that goal. So it's been great hanging out with Tian and all of you, talking about this September issue. It's been a long-standing dream to make The Gift be a really full magazine, especially one that's like topically focused like this, where all of you can learn a lot more about Puerh. And as I said, I genuinely think that this is definitely one of, if not the largest collection of English information on Puerh tea. And I hope that it serves a lot of people. You know, eventually all of our Global Tea Hut magazines are put up onto our website for free. So even people who are not members will be able to access this information as time goes on. And that's very meaningful and inspiring to me. I've had a great time talking and drinking King of the Forest. It feels really good. Yeah. It's got a really nice grounding vibrancy to it. We hope that all of you enjoy it too. Again, if you have any questions that you'd like us to talk about in these videos, you can email them to globalteahut@gmail.com.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and blessed to be sitting here with one of my favorite people in the world, Wuda, and enjoy King of the Forest.